It's always a wonderful time to be able to speak to mothers and to share a sermon related to them. But of course, as all things in the Word of God, it applies to all of us. And I think you'll all find a lot of application in this for each of your lives. Certainly it applies to fathers as well. And mothers, as you hear the sermon, you will certainly want dads to be listening as well to what we have to say today. It applies to grandparents. If you have grandkids, or if you work in the church around kids, or you have neighbors, all these things apply to each of us. In a way, if you take time to think about it, it even applies to things like if you just have friends and the way that you interact with their lives. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to primarily focus on mothers today, and so all my application for most part will focus on mothers, just because it's Mother's Day. But one of the things that God gives us is moms and dads, but He gives us incredible opportunities in our children's lives. I mean, there's just opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. The most obvious one, which all of us dads, of course, as you say, probably every, Mother's Day, is you get the opportunity of carrying a child for 9 months and delivering a child. Not that any of us dads want that. We're glad that's your opportunity, but it is a wonderful opportunity. In whatever way that's an opportunity for you, I don't understand it, but it is. And then you're the first one usually that gets to hold that baby and look into their eyes and begin bonding with them. And it's amazing. And then you get to see them find their hands and they find their feet. Sometimes they find their poopy and you don't like that and you have to teach them not to do that. But it's true, our kids did. I'm sure your kids did too. But then all of a sudden they push up and you get so excited when they push up. And then all of a sudden before you know it, they scoot. It may be an inch forward or it may be 2 inches backwards, but you're like, yeah, they're mobile, they're moving. You're so excited about that. And then they sit up, and they can sit up by themselves without the pillows behind them. And before you know it, they're crawling, and they're pulling up on furniture, and all of a sudden they're walking. It's just, when I saw your two girls walking, I was like, oh my lands, they're already walking. I couldn't believe it. And then you say, oh no, they're mobile, And then you got to chase them around. You got to take paper clips away from them when they're near outlets. And you have to teach them not to pull on the doggy and cat's tails. And, and all of a sudden you begin teaching and investing in them all kinds of stuff. Now, for the first several years, it's a lot of just life or death kinds of things, like paper clips and outlets and things like that. But you have opportunities to teach them. And before you know it, these little ones, they grow up and they're in, preschool, and then they're in elementary school. And before you know it, they're in middle school and then high school. And then they're in college and they're getting married and then they have their own kids. It's amazing. And when you're back at the very beginning, it just seems like you have forever. And in some ways you do. You have forever. It's a long time. But, those first set of years really are kind of, the basics in life. And I kind of think of, not that parenting starts at first grade, but kind of the logic end starts in, first grade or so, because that's when they really can start thinking logically and that kind of thing. And so if you kind of think that way, you think that you've got 12 years. And one of the things that I learned as a parent, I kind of had thought through a lot of things, but one of the things that was really a surprise to me that I knew logically, but it didn't impact me, is that after 12th grade, your parenting comes to an end for the most part, and you transition from parenting to coaching. Now that's kind of a surprise. Like Chloe, what year are you? What grade are you in? Which one are you finishing? What? 10th. 2 years, 2 years you guys have. 2 years with her. And you could get, Lake, what year are you? 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. 3 years. 3 years you guys have. 3 years. And all these phases along the way, God gives us opportunities to teach them about our faith, about encouraging them, about what is, how you have a relationship with a boy or a girl, and how you become a godly father, how you become a godly mother, how you build, a good work ethic into them. There's all these opportunities that we have to invest in them all along the way. But the problem comes is that mom and dad also have their own kind of dreams, right? Now, those first years, you have to feed them. You have to change their poopy diaper. You have to give them a bath. Those are things that just you have to do. But as they get older, somewhere along the line, they begin to become more independent, right? And it's easy somewhere along the line to shift from being full-time mom or dad to almost like parenting in autopilot, because they can feed themselves. They can drive at some point. They can go out and play by themselves. They can come home when you whistle or, call or text. I mean, my dad whistled, now we just text. But, when you text them, they can do those things. And so it's easy, if we're not careful, to put our parenting on autopilot. And where we were teaching them all kinds of things when they were young, we begin to miss some of those opportunities as they grow up. Now, yeah, it's important that they don't put the paperclip in the outlet, but it's also important that as they begin dating, that you're there to help them through that as well. As if they're in grade school and someone, pushes them down in line, or someone pulls their hair, or they call them something, or when they're dating and a boyfriend kind of pressures them to doing things that they don't want to do, or any number of things. It's important that we as parents are there to help them continue to think right and to be able to interpret things that happen to them. It's just so absolutely important that we as parents are there in a part of their lives, and we don't go into autopilot just because they can take care of the basics and just kind of let them coast all the way through high school, because there are windows of opportunity for us. And that's how I like to think of it. I think of it, this is kind of like when I was raising our kids, this is how Kelly and I thought about it. There are windows of opportunities. Usually I could not sit down, and have a conversation and say, okay, Andrew, we're going to talk about parenting, or we're going to talk about marriage, or we're going to talk about work ethic. I mean, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But usually when you sit down, you have a long conversation, you think, okay, I'm going to cover all the points in a good work ethic, or I'm going to cover all the points in treating your friends kindly, or you can do that, and you should do that, and that's what we do here at church. But usually the way it works is they're at school, and a best friend rejects them and goes and finds another friend. For a day, 2, 3, 4, there's a window of opportunity. They open that window up, and they're hurting, and they will allow you in at that point in time because they want to talk, and they've got something that they need to deal with. And if we're in autopilot and we're busy doing our own thing, going our own direction, busy in hobby or work or sports, our own sports, or being with our friends, or whatever it is, then we miss that opportunity, and they will shut the window, and that will pass. Now, they may go to a friend and get help from them, which sometimes is not really where you want them to go, especially like, let's say there's a dating thing, and a guy is pressuring you, or a girl's pressuring you, and there's a window. They don't want to do that or whatever, and that window comes up, and they're able to talk because there's a situation they don't know how to deal with. And if mom or dad aren't there to kind of have that conversation, they may go to a friend, and they'll have a conversation, or to watch a movie and get advice there, or a song, or just the way our world is. And that window closes for us. And so we have to be there as parents when those windows open up, because they're few and in between. And usually for us, the way that I kind of worked it in, because it's something we have to work into our schedule, the way I worked it in is we went for walks. It's just how we did it. I would go on a walk with our kids once, 2 times, sometimes 3 times a week. And that would give me time to kind of see where they're at, see if there's any windows that have opened up, and give them an opportunity to talk. That's just how we did it. Now, you could do it a different way. If your kids are young, you might read a story with them at night and then sit and kind of talk at night. They love it. Anything to not go to bed. They love doing that. Something when they're young, you could do that. Or it may be that you go out for coffee or however you work it into your schedule. There just needs to be times where you're available for those windows of opportunity. Now, what I'd like to look at today is Nehemiah, because Nehemiah had this same kind of event, this same kinds of things in his life, and I'd like to look at how he kind of processed this and how he went through the things that God had prepared for him to do. And I think there's a lot of parallels, a lot of truths, a lot of principles that we can gain from that to help us in our own lives. And so if you have your Bibles, you can open to Nehemiah chapter 6. We'll also have the verses up here, and you also on the back of your bulletin, you'll have a chance to be able to take some notes there. But there's a couple principles that I'd like to look at to what Nehemiah did in his life that helped him to kind of work through this that I think will help us, because there's a lot of parallels between the two of us. And the first thing that we see in Nehemiah chapter 6 is that Nehemiah, he knew what his finish line was. He knew what his goal was. He knew where God had called him to go. And he knew where he was headed during that time. Now, for Nehemiah, his time was short, just like us. As parenting, it's not a lifetime thing. I mean, you're their parent for life, but really there's those, that first through 12th grade years where you're going to be doing a lot of investing in helping them grow in their character, helping them think in a way that's biblical. And so I kind of think of those 12 years as our time. Nehemiah had a little less than 2 months to do what God had called him to do. So there's that parallel. But the first thing that we see is that Nehemiah had a finish line. Now, to get to where Nehemiah's at, we have to kind of go back 100 years. 100 years before Nehemiah's time, Babylonian, Nebuchadnezzar, if you're familiar with him, if you read your Old Testament some, you'll kind of be familiar with who that is. But the Israelites were in their own kingdom, and the Babylonians became a strong force. They became a world force, and they took over country after country after country. And eventually, when it became the Israelites' turn, they wiped them out. They burned all their gates down. They destroyed all of their walls. They just became rubble. They tore everything down, and they took all of the learned, all the wealthy, all those who had skills, and they took them to Babylon. That's when Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel were all taken to Babylon, and they took all of their best people, and they left the people who had no skills and no real understanding behind to fend for themselves. It was a hard time for those people because they had no walls for protection, and they had nothing really to deal with because they didn't have a lot of the skills that they depended on the other people for. And 100 years later, over that time period, Persia began to grow in power, and they basically took over Babylonia. And they became the world force, and that's where we find Nehemiah. Nehemiah had come up in the Persian Empire, and he was the cupbearer of the king, and the cupbearer is the person who tastes the wine for him to make sure there's no poison he would drop over instead of the king. So he was the cupbearer, so he was always by his side. Probably had quite a relationship. From what we see here, it's very likely he had a pretty good relationship with the king. Even though he was a servant, he had a good relationship. And along the lines, what happened was, Nehemiah was a Jewish man, and even though he had been in Persia his whole life, he knew of the Israelites in Jerusalem. And so he still had a heart for his people. And so one day, a couple people from Jerusalem came to Persia, and he saw them, and he said, "How are my brothers and sisters? How are they doing in Jerusalem?" And the guy said, "It's horrible. It's terrible. I mean, they are barely being able to make it. There are no city walls, and the neighboring towns and kingdoms and warlords and all that, they're just coming in. They just take their crops. They take whatever livestock they have, and they are barely struggling to stay alive." And at that point, Nehemiah had a heart for his people. And God, I think, rose up a desire in Nehemiah to go back and help his people. But Nehemiah was a slave. I mean, you can't, as a slave, you can't just take off and go do that. And so Nehemiah had a heart for that, and he prayed. He said, God, give me the ability to go back. And so he prayed that, and he did a very risky thing. The king saw that he had a sad face, which was not something you would show to a king. I think you could be killed for that alone. And the king said, why the sad face, Nehemiah? And Nehemiah told him what had gone on. And he asked him, can I go and help them build the wall again? And Artaxerxes said, not only can you go, but I will make you the governor of Jerusalem. You can take the supplies, you can take money, you can take whatever you need to go back and do that, and to go back and to rebuild the city. And so he goes back. And he begins to, the first thing he does, he goes around the city and he looks at all the things that are there, all the things that are needed done. He sees that the economy is horrible, the water situation is terrible, everything's destroyed, the walls are down, the people don't have any real leadership. Leadership needs to be brought up. There's a thousand things to do. But Nehemiah knew his finish line. He knew his goal. And so that began to dictate everything Nehemiah did. And so he begins to build. And they build, and they build, and they build. They pull the stones, and they build, and they build. And the wall gets higher and higher and higher. And all of a sudden, the warlords and all the other kings around that were just looting, they began to be concerned, because they were rebuilding the walls. And they began to realize that this is going to be a force that we're going to have to reckon with. This is going to be a force that they may even raise up armies. And so they begin to send in spies and send in people to try to discourage the Jews and the Israelites from rebuilding the wall. But none of it works, and the wall gets higher and higher and higher, because Nehemiah is going after his goal, his dream, his timeline, or his finish line that God had called him to do, because he knew what his finish line was. And then we get into the second thing that I think we can learn from Nehemiah, is that his finish line, or our finish line, it determines our obstacles. Now, when we're parenting, I mean, if I have the goal in my mind that I want to raise up my kids to be godly kids, it's tough. It's a hard thing to do. And there are going to be there are tons of obstacles that get in the way. I mean, there's lots of things. I mean, they're not all bad. It's not bad things necessarily. Sometimes they're good things. They're like I said, hobbies, or it could be just things I want to get involved in. But knowing our finish line helps us to understand what the obstacles are along the way. What is it that's going to set me aside? What is it that's going to distract me? When I used to run cross country in high school, I knew where the starting point was. I knew where the finish line was. And to actually win, I would walk the whole track, and I would decide, okay, here's this S-turn, so I can actually cut off steps if I will take this direct path. And if I come to this corner on the inside, there's actually all this water and mud, so I need to take this side. And I would decide exactly what path to take, because that's the only way that I had a chance of winning, is to figure out exactly what course I needed to take to win. And the same thing is true with parenting, because it's hard. I mean, raising these guys, from infants to these guys up to college, it's tough. And there's lots of things that get in our way. There's lots of ways to get into autopilot and not be able to actually get there. And Nehemiah finds this true for himself as well. He has his own set of obstacles. So let's just go back to him a little bit and pull some principles from this. So Nehemiah 6:1 says this: when it was reported to Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, three of his enemies, three of his obstacles, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies, that I had rebuilt the wall, and that no breach, no break, no low points at this point were in the wall. It says, when I had rebuilt the wall, and that no breach remained in it, although at that time I had not set up the doors and the gates. So he had completed the wall, except for the gates and the doors were still open. So that's where he's at this point. And at that point, when his enemies saw what was going on, they realized everything they had been trying to do to discourage the people weren't working. And so they began to figure out, how can we discourage Nehemiah himself? Because he's the leader. He's the one leading this thing. So they set up a plan. And so they decide to write him a letter. And in verse 2 it says, "Then Sanballat and Geshem sent a message," or a letter to me, saying, "Come, let us meet at Kepharim in the plain of Ono." I mean, maybe we could do breakfast, or we could get together for lunch, or maybe do coffee. Let's just get together and talk. We've been back and forth a little bit here. We need to kind of reconcile this and figure this out. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a fine request. There's nothing immoral about that. But because Nehemiah knew what his finish line was, he realized, and he has a limited amount of time, he knew that this was a distraction, and that this was something that he needed to not do. It says, and then later at some point, in some way, he realized that they were planning to harm him, as he says. Now, he realized that they were a distraction. Now, we have the same thing in life, and our distractions could be a boss, it could be a best friend, it could be a hobby, it could be work, it could be all kinds of things. It could be emotional. It could be maybe there's dealing with depression, or maybe there's a need to want other people to like you, or to be friends, or be in the in group, or to be accepted. There's all kinds of things that cause us to do things that aren't the best thing for what we're trying to achieve. I think sometimes they can literally be little enemies. I mean, we might drink too much. There might be an addiction to prescription drugs. There could be a guy down the road, or a girl at work. These are real live enemies that we have to be very careful about. You talk about destroying our kids, it destroys everything. And they're enemies, they're distractions, they're things that are put there by either our own sin nature, our own temptations, or by the devil himself, but they are real live enemies. But it could be lesser things, like I said, the hobbies and just typical daily distractions. But I think it's important that we're able to identify them in our lives and put a name on them. This is a distraction for me. That's a distraction for me. If that's my finish line, and we have to define that, I'm not defining that for you. We all have to define our own finish line for our own families and what we want to do. But if this is my finish line, this is a distraction, and that's a distraction, and that's a distraction, and that's a distraction. If I'm going to run the course, it's got to be straight down this line if I'm going to finish the course. And so not only do we need to know what our finish line is, and not only does that finish line help us determine what our distractions are, but the third thing here is I believe that our finish line determines our daily course. Now, in some ways, parenting is 24/7. It is, but it's not really. I mean, you've got to sleep, you've got to eat, you've got to do life. There's lots of things that you have to do. And so it's, I'm certainly not saying you've got to figure out, and I've got to figure out how to do it 24/7. That's impossible. God doesn't even ask us to do that. But we do have to figure out how we're going to do it, right? I mean, you're not doing it. That's not the only thing in life. But in life, we have to figure out how we're going to get to that goal. And so I think our finish line determines what our daily course needs to be able to get there. Look at what Nehemiah says. So again, going back to verse 2, and then we'll go to verse 3. Sanballat and Geshem sent a message to me saying, "Come, let us meet together." but they were planning to harm me. So I sent a message to them saying, I am doing a great work with my kids. I'm doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to meet you? I mean, think about it. I am doing a great work. I can't veer off this direction right now. Maybe when they go to college. I can't veer off in that direction right now. I'm doing a great work. It is so important that I help them through these years to get on track, to get going the right direction, to help them interpret life, to help them understand why things happen the way they do, to help them understand how to maneuver through the things they have to maneuver to. I'm doing a great work. I can't come down right now. I just can't. I'm not saying, it's not 24/7. There are things we can do, but there are certain things that are distractions, and I just can't do that right now. I just can't. I just can't do it. And we have to be able to say no. Sometimes our boss asks us, yeah, I need you to do this. I'm sorry, I can't do that. You need to. I'm sorry, I can't. Is there a limit where we say, I just can't do that? It might cost us, or whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we just have to be able to say, I'm sorry, I can't do that right now. I just can't do that right now in my life. And over we get asked. Look at verse 4. It says, 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. I am doing a great work. I just can't come down right now. I just can't do it. And the last thing I want to say here is we have to pray for strength. It's hard. And it's tough to say these things. And look what he says. He says, his enemies, they continued to threaten him. They got to the point where they sent him another letter. It was an open letter so that everybody could see it, so that rumors would begin. And they began to say, you're wanting to be king. You're wanting to rebel against Persia. And they began to threaten and say these things so that the Persian king would hear it. And so that hopefully Nehemiah would flee back to Persia and say, no, it's not true, and explain himself. And Nehemiah shook his head and said, I'm not coming down. Let it be what it is. I'm going to stick to what I'm doing. I'm going to stick to my finish line. And so it says that he prays for strength. It says in verse 9, they were all trying to frighten us, thinking that their hand will get too weak for the work, and it will not be completed. In other words, they were doing these things hoping that they would just, in fear, just say, we can't do it anymore. It's just too much. And so Nehemiah says, but I prayed, now strengthen my hand. God, strengthen my hand. Because this is hard. It's tough. The choices in life, they're hard. It's hard to say no to things. It is. It's tough. God, strengthen my hand. Give me the ability to do what I need to do. Now, sometimes it could be like this. Sometimes what we do is, we work all day, come home, and I don't know about you, but I'm tired at the end of the day. And so, I might want to sit and relax. Maybe we watch TV. Maybe the weekend comes, say, I worked all week long, and I just want to relax. And so we relax all weekend. And then when someone asks us to do something, maybe at church or ministry, I'm sorry, I've got to, I'm focused on my kids, can't do that. Whereas really we could do it. We just took all of our time doing other things like TV and relaxing. So I'm not saying, to use it as an excuse. I think sometimes we have to pray, God, give me the ability to keep my life intact. It's keeping you first. It's keeping my wife or my husband second. It's keeping my kids third. that's keeping ministry and church forth, or however you're ordering your life, and help me to do that, to live out that life. It's hard. And so Nehemiah prayed. And then it says, after a little more time goes by, it says in verse 15, so the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. 52 days. It wasn't a long time. It's not forever. It was finished in 52 days. It came and it went. And Nehemiah went back to life as normal. He had to go back to the king. The king said, you can go, but only for a time. And he prays this in verse 16. When all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations surround us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of God. Now the thing about Nehemiah is there were no miracles. The lightning bolts didn't strike the enemies. There were no earthquakes that swallowed up the people. It was just mom and dad building the wall next to their house. Everybody did their portion of the wall to protect their family, to protect their kids. They knew what the finish line was. They knew what the goal was. They knew what the obstacles were because they were trying to distract them as well as Nehemiah. And they just kept working. They just kept working. They just kept at it. And the strength of God helped them to accomplish. It says, and this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. And so that's my encouragement to you, is that you know what your finish line is. You know what your goal is. And you decide that. You determine that. And once you know that, you can look in your life and you can see the obstacles. What's going to keep you from getting to that finish line? Are you an autopilot as a parent, letting kind of life just go and letting your kids do their thing? Are you still actively involved? Have you set up times in your kids' life, whether they're infants and you're already starting that process, or they're teens, where you're involved and you're helping them correctly interpret life? Because you guys, you're going through things, and as things happen, it's really helpful to have someone there that says, no. The reason that's happening is this, or this is how you should handle that, or here's something to consider. And we just got to be there for that.